Okay, today we conclude Chapter 21, The Cold War Begins. We're on Section 4, Eisenhower's Policies. Main idea. As president, Eisenhower developed plans to reduce world tensions while containing and competing with communism. An American story. On May 1st, 1960, CIA pilot Francis Gary Powers sat in the cockpit of his U-2 spy plane, flying at more than 60,000 feet over Afghanistan. His mission was to fly over suspected Soviet missile bases and photograph them. As Powers passed over the forbidden border into the Soviet Union, he felt a familiar thrill. There was no abrupt change in topography, he remembered. Yet the moment you crossed the border, you sensed the difference, knowing there were people who would shoot you down if they could create a strange tension. I wondered how the Russians felt, knowing I was up here, unable to do anything about it. I could imagine their frustration and rage. Suddenly, Powers heard a dull thump. A surface-to-air missile exploded nearby in a flash of orange. The plane's wings snapped off, leaving the spinning aircraft plummeting down towards the earth. Powers screamed, "I've had it now!" The downing of Powers' plane set off one of the major confrontations of the Cold War during the presidency of Dwight D. Eisenhower. Adapted from Mayday, the U-2 affair. Eisenhower's new look. By the end of 1952, many Americans were ready for a change in leadership. The Cold War had much to do with that attitude. Many Americans believed that Truman's foreign policy was not working. The Soviet Union had acquired the atomic bomb and consolidated its hold on Eastern Europe. China had fallen to communism, and American troops had been sent across the Pacific to fight in the Korean War. Tired of the criticism and uncertain he could win, Truman decided not to run again. The Democrats nominated Adlai Stevenson, governor of Illinois. The Republicans chose Dwight D. Eisenhower, the general who had organized the D-Day invasion. Despite Stevenson's charming personality and skilled speech-making, he had no chance against a national hero who had helped win World War II. Americans were looking for someone they could trust to lead the nation in its Cold War struggle against communism. Eisenhower won in a landslide. More bang for the buck. The Cold War shaped Eisenhower's thinking from the moment he took office. Eisenhower was convinced that the key to victory in the Cold War was not simply military might, but also a strong economy. The United States had to show the world that free enterprise could produce a better and more prosperous society than communism. At the same time, economic prosperity would prevent communists from gaining support in the United States and protect society from subversion. As a professional soldier, Eisenhower knew the cost associated with a large-scale conventional war. Preparing for that kind of warfare, he believed, would cost far too much money. "We cannot defend the nation in a way which will exhaust our economy," Eisenhower declared. A new look in defense policy was needed. Instead of maintaining a large, expensive army, the nation must be prepared to use atomic weapons in all forms. Nuclear weapons, he said, gave more bang for the buck. Massive retaliation. The Korean War had convinced Eisenhower that the United States could not contain communism by fighting a series of small wars. Such wars were unpopular and too expensive. Instead, they had to be prevented from happening in the first place. The best way to do that seemed to be to threaten the use of nuclear weapons if a communist state tried to seize territory by force. This policy came to be known as massive retaliation. The new policy enabled Eisenhower to cut military spending from $50 billion to $34 billion. He did this by cutting back the army, which required a lot of money to maintain. At the same time, he increased America's nuclear arsenal from about 1,000 bombs in 1953 to 18,000 bombs in 1961. The Sputnik Crisis. The New Look's emphasis on nuclear weapons required new technology to deliver them. In 1955, the Air Force unveiled the huge B-52 bomber, which was designed to fly across continents and drop nuclear bombs anywhere in the world. Because bombers could be shot down, Eisenhower also began developing intercontinental ballistic missiles, or ICBMs, that could deliver bombs anywhere in the world. He also began a program to build submarines capable of launching nuclear missiles. As the United States began to develop long-range nuclear missiles, Americans were stunned to discover that the Soviet Union had already developed their own. On October 4th, 1957, the Soviets launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite to orbit the Earth. The technological triumph alarmed Americans, who took it as a sign that the United States was falling behind the Soviet Union in missile technology. Eisenhower insisted he was not worried just because the Soviets put one small ball into the air. Members of Congress, on the other hand, feared the nation was falling behind in scientific research. The following year, Congress created the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or NASA, to coordinate research in rocket science and space exploration. It also passed the National Defense Education Act, NDEA, which provided funds for education and training in science, math, and foreign languages. Brinkmanship in action. President Eisenhower's apparent willingness to threaten nuclear war to maintain the peace worried some people. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, however, the dominant figure in the nation's foreign policy in the 1950s, strongly defended the policy. You have to take chances for peace, just as you must take chances in war. Some say that we were brought to the verge of war. Of course we were brought to the verge of war. The ability to get to the verge without getting into war is the necessary art. If you try to run away from it, if you are scared to go to the brink, you are lost. We've had to look it square in the face. We walked to the brink and we looked it in the face. We took strong action. Quoted in Rise to Globalism. Critics called this brinkmanship the willingness to go to the brink of war to force the other side to back down, and argued that it was too dangerous. Several times, however, President Eisenhower felt compelled to threaten nuclear war during a crisis. The Korean War ends. During his campaign for presidency, Eisenhower had said, "I shall go to Korea," promising to end the costly and increasingly unpopular war. On December 4th, 1952, just weeks after his election, he kept his promise. Bundled against the freezing Korean winter, the president-elect talked with frontline commanders and their troops. Eisenhower became convinced that the ongoing battle was costing too many lives and bringing too few victories. "Small attacks on small hills," the former general declared, "will not end this war." The president then quietly let the Chinese know that the United States might continue the Korean War under circumstances of our own choosing, a hint at nuclear attack. The threat to go to the brink of nuclear war seemed to work. In July 1953, negotiators signed an armistice. The battle line between the two sides, which was very near the pre-war boundary, became the border between North Korea and South Korea. A demilitarized zone, or DMZ, separated them. There was no victory, but the war had at least stopped the spread of communism in Korea, the goal of containment. American troops are still based in Korea, helping South Korea defend its border. The Taiwan Crisis. Shortly after the war ended, a new crisis erupted in Asia. Although the Chinese communists had taken power in mainland China, the Chinese nationalists still controlled Taiwan and several small islands along China's coast. In the fall of 1954, China threatened to seize two of the islands from the nationalists. Eisenhower saw Taiwan as part of the anti-communist barrier in Asia. When China began shelling the islands and announced that Taiwan would soon be liberated, Eisenhower asked Congress to authorize the use of force to defend Taiwan. Eisenhower then warned the Chinese that any attempt to invade Taiwan would be resisted by American naval forces stationed nearby. He and Dulles hinted that they would use nuclear weapons to stop an invasion. Soon afterward, China backed down. The Suez Crisis. The year after Eisenhower went to the brink of war with China, a serious crisis erupted in the Middle East. Eisenhower's goal in the Middle East was to prevent Arab nations from aligning with the Soviet Union. To build support among Arabs, Dulles offered to help Egypt finance the construction of a dam on the Nile River. The Egyptians eagerly accepted the American offer. The deal ran into trouble in Congress, however, because Egypt had bought weapons from communist Czechoslovakia. Dulles was forced to withdraw the offer. A week later, Egyptian troops seized control of the Suez Canal from the Anglo-French company that had controlled it. The Egyptians intended to use the canal's profits to pay for the dam. The British and French responded quickly to the Suez Crisis. In October 1956, British and French troops invaded Egypt. Eisenhower was furious with Britain and France. He declared that they had made a complete mess and botch of things. The situation became even more tense when the Soviet Union threatened rocket attacks on Britain and France and offered to send troops to help Egypt. Eisenhower immediately put American nuclear forces on alert, noting, "If those fellows start something, we may have to hit them, and if necessary, with everything in the bucket." Under strong American pressure, the British and the French called off their invasion. The Soviet Union had won a major diplomatic victory, however, by supporting Egypt. Soon afterward, other Arab nations began accepting Soviet aid as well. Fighting communism covertly. President Eisenhower relied on brinkmanship on several occasions, but he knew it could not work in all situations. It could prevent war, but it could not, for example, prevent communists from staging revolutions within countries. To prevent communist uprisings in other countries, Eisenhower decided to use covert or hidden operations conducted by the Central Intelligence Agency, or the CIA. Containment in developing nations. Many of the CIA's operations took place in developing nations, nations with primarily agricultural economies. Many of these countries blamed European imperialism and American capitalism for their problems. Their leaders looked to the Soviet Union as a model of how to industrialize their countries. They often threatened to nationalize or put under government control foreign businesses operating in their countries. American officials feared that these leaders might align their nations with the Soviet Union or even stage a communist revolution. One way to stop developing nations from moving into the communist camp was to provide them with financial aid, as Eisenhower had tried to do in Egypt. In some cases, however, where the threat of communism seemed stronger, the CIA staged covert operations to overthrow anti-American leaders and replace them with pro-American leaders. Iran and Guatemala. Two examples of covert operations that achieved American objectives took place in Iran and Guatemala. By 1953, Iranian Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh had already nationalized the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. He seemed ready to make an oil deal with the Soviet Union. In 1953, Mossadegh moved against the pro-American Shah of Iran, who was temporarily forced into exile. Dulles quickly sent agents to organize street riots and arrange a coup that ousted Mossadegh, and the Shah returned to power. The following year, the CIA acted to protect American-owned property in Guatemala. In 1951, Jacobo Arbenz Guzman won an election as president of Guatemala with communist support. His land reform program took over large estates, including those of American-owned United Fruit Company. In May 1954, communist Czechoslovakia delivered arms to Guatemala. The CIA responded by arming the Guatemalan opposition and training them at secret camps in Nicaragua and Honduras. Shortly after the CIA-trained forces invaded Guatemala, Arbenz Guzman left office. Uprising in Hungary. Covert operations did not always work as Eisenhower had hoped. In 1953, Stalin died, and a power struggle began in the Soviet Union. By 1956, Nikita Khrushchev had emerged as the leader of the Soviet Union. That year, Khrushchev delivered a secret speech to Soviet leaders. He attacked Stalin's policies and insisted there were many ways to build a communist society. Although the speech was secret, the CIA obtained a copy. With Eisenhower's permission, the CIA arranged for it to be broadcast to Eastern Europe. Many Eastern Europeans had long been frustrated with communist rule. Hearing Khrushchev's speech further discredited communism. In June 1956, riots erupted in Eastern Europe. By late October, a full-scale uprising had begun in Hungary. Although Khrushchev was willing to tolerate greater freedom in Eastern Europe, he had never meant to imply that the Soviets would tolerate an end to communism in Eastern Europe. Soon after the uprising began, Soviet tanks rolled into Budapest, the capital of Hungary, and crushed the rebellion. Continuing tensions. The uprising in Hungary forced Khrushchev to reassert Soviet power and the superiority of communism. Previously, he had supported the peaceful coexistence with capitalism. Now he accused the capitalist countries of starting feverish arms races. In 1957, after the launch of Sputnik, Khrushchev boasted, "We will bury capitalism. Your grandchildren will live under communism." In late 1958, Khrushchev demanded that the United States, Great Britain, and France withdraw their troops from West Berlin. Secretary of State Dulles rejected Khrushchev's demands. If the Soviets threatened Berlin, Dulles announced NATO would respond, if need be, by military force. Brinkmanship worked again, and Khrushchev backed down. To try to improve relations, Eisenhower invited Khrushchev to visit the United States in 1959. The visit went well, and the two leaders agreed to hold a summit in Paris in 1960. A summit is a formal face-to-face meeting of leaders from different countries to discuss important issues. Shortly before the summit was to begin, the Soviet Union shot down the American U-2 spy plane piloted by Francis Gary Powers. At first, Eisenhower claimed that the aircraft was a weather plane and had strayed off course. Then Khrushchev dramatically produced the pilot. Eisenhower refused to apologize, saying the flights had protected American security. In response, Khrushchev broke up the summit. In this climate of heightened tension, President Eisenhower prepared to leave office. In January 1961, he delivered a farewell address to the nation. In the address, he pointed out that the new relationship had developed between the military establishment and the defense industry. He warned Americans to be on guard against the immense influence of this military-industrial complex in a democracy. Although he had avoided war and kept communism contained, Eisenhower admitted to some frustration, "I confess I lay down my official responsibility in this field with a definite sense of disappointment. I wish I could say that a lasting peace is in sight."